Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me this week we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And writer and broadcaster Candice Holdsworth.
Hello.
Coming up on today's show, the return of the Remoaners, Rishi Sunak's flip-flopping on trans kids, and the protests in Peckham. If you haven't already, make sure you not only subscribe to this podcast on whatever channel you listen to it, but if you're watching us on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and click the bell, and then you can keep up with all of our great content. So it feels like the Remoaners are back in a big way. There's been a couple of incidents in the past week or so. We've seen a sort of EU flag waving frenzy at the last night of the proms. There was a leading civil servant came out and said he was a Remainer. He admitted that he told all of his colleagues that he voted Remain. And we even had Sir Keir Starmer talking about using the EU as a potential solution for the migrant crisis in the Channel. Tom, does this worry you a bit? Is this the wrong direction we're going in potentially?
Well, I don't think they've ever really gone away, have they?
Yeah.
And I think what's happened now is that their tails are up. I think there was a kind of period in which they were beaten back, particularly by the 2019 election result. And now I think there's a kind of sense that with the dispatching of Johnson, with Keir Starmer riding high in the polls, even to a certain extent with Rishi Sunak rather than someone else in charge of the Tory party, that they're kind of back in the driving seat. They're a bit more cocksure than before. What I find fascinating is that since Brexit, and particularly in the last couple of years, you have had this horrible kind of flowering, like kind of fungus flowering of sort of all these new sort of Remoaner podcasts, influencers, characters, the sort of rest is politics type kind of back in a big way. And this has kind of all been built off of a certain narrative, which has been easily propagated because of the fact that Johnson has been dispatched and Brexiteers have been a bit demoralised and so on, which is that the country's going to a hell in a handcart, that forget Ukraine, forget COVID, the reason for it is because of Brexit. Even though at the moment that narrative is completely fallen apart for reasons that you've written about on Spikes the other week, about the fact that this totemic claim of theirs that the UK was the one country in the G7 that was still to recover from the pandemic recession, despite the fact that those figures have since been revised. We actually recovered in 2021, that's been kind of blown to smithereens. They still carry on regardless. There's a sense in which nothing can really dent their narrative at this point. And I think what it really speaks to is the fact that they feel, not wrongly, that they've kind of taken back control a little bit of certainly of the political class, certainly of the initiative. And I think that's why it's so important that people who care about pushing back those kind of quite technocratic characters should do so, because they think that they've won the argument, even though going on what's actually happened, they've completely lost it. But there you go.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, because we obviously all remember Project Fear during the referendum, all these claims that we're all going to be £4,000 worse off. There will be an age of austerity to come. There will be all kinds of unemployment will rise. We know that was predicted in the wake of a Brexit vote, let alone actually leaving the EU. Now we've had the referendum, we've actually left the EU, we fully left out of the transition period in December 2020 during the pandemic. And none of the things they promised or warned about have actually come to pass. There have, of course, been major economic challenges from COVID, from the war in Ukraine. But as you pointed to earlier, Tom, this whole narrative that Britain is falling behind uniquely because of Brexit, the worst performing country in the G7. It's just nonsense. It's just been completely blown away in recent weeks by a revision to GDP that suggested that the economy is 2% larger than we thought it was. Normally when GDP figures get revised, it's like a few point something percentages here and there. This absolutely blew the Remainer narrative out of the water. And yet, they still don't change their tune. It's simply asserted that Brexit is a disaster. It's simply asserted that if a bad thing happens, it must have been due to Brexit. And it seems as if the truth doesn't get through. For people who claim that Brexit was won on disinformation, it's quite extraordinary that they keep peddling this line with no facts to back it up.
Yes, I mean, there's been no sort of mutual shift in their position. And it's so true. That was a massive thing, like you wrote about in your article. Initially, the GDP figures that we originally had were used to feed a certain narrative, that Britain is an economic outlier. But now the data's changed, as it does, it often does, and they haven't acknowledged it. There's been no shift in that position. And that's really important because they predicate so much of their arguments on Brexit being a disaster in the economic sphere.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's never really come to pass. I mean, for me personally, Brexit was never really about economics. I mean, there were many who talked up the big upside of it. It was always more in the realm of sovereignty, political ideas, independence. And I always thought that was very easily achieved. I often did disagree with Brexiteers who always tried to present it as a utopian vision, because I thought, well, there could be challenges. You could be adding more friction. That is possible. But obviously, you have to weigh up, balance what is more important. And for me, the politics were always more important than the economics.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that, given the reaction or lack of reaction to the sort of revised GDP figures, it's not really about the economy for Remainers, and I'm not sure that it ever has been. That's why it so wounded them. There have been all kinds of economic debates over the past couple of years, couple of decades, austerity, there's debate over that. That didn't wound people in the same way when they felt they lost the argument over that. Really, this was about losing, Brussels, losing rule by technocracy, essentially. It was their class that took a knock from the Brexit vote.
I think the economy was important to Remain voters, and you see that in the polls, So in the aftermath of the vote, number one issue for Leavers was the question of sovereignty, democracy. For Remainers, it was concerns about the economy. That kind of makes perfect sense. But for the kind of elite Remainers, the Remoaners, if you will, the influencers that we're talking about, the people who haven't stopped banging on about the vote being the worst thing that ever happened to be in a sliding scale down to the 1930s or something, it's not really been about the economy. That's just a stick with which they wanted to beat Brexiteers with. And when that's denied to them, they'll just go after something else. It's not even really about the EU either. I mean, I was thinking about this in relation to the proms and that really kind of cringe way in which it's just become a way in which anti-Brexit campaigners hand out their EU flags and wave them in the big finale when usually people would be flying the Union flag and so on. You think, what is it you're waving that flag for?
Yeah.
You didn't own that flag until about 5 minutes ago. You certainly didn't own one before the vote itself. There were no pro-EU demonstrations before the referendum. No one knew who Guy Verhofstadt was. No one ever, painted their face in the blue and yellow. Their supposed love of the European Union, I think, is quite clearly just an expression of their distaste for the people who voted to leave it. You just wonder, what is it that you love so much? Is it all the regulations? Do you like the corruption? Do you like the lobbyists? Do you like they claim to be internationalists? Do you like these horrendous policies that are battering jobs and exporters in Africa? Do you like them paying North African dictators, and militiamen money to keep migrants away from the Mediterranean? Is this the sort of thing that you like? What is it that you actually like so much? I think it comes down to the fact that they know not very much about the European Union. They care even less about it. It's just the fact that they intuitively and rightly understood it as a kind of check on the democratic wishes of people that in this country that they happen to dislike, working class people in particular. So I think that's one of the things that this particular, not Remain voters, but this kind of elite Remainer subculture which has popped up, it's really only defined entirely in the negative, which is why their opinions don't change when the data changes, because it's never really been about that in the first place.
I mean, or perhaps they just, are blown away by the sheer talent and charisma of Ursula von der Leyen, but maybe not. Candice.
Yes, I mean, I think it's become a form of identity now. And I think that's also why there's a lot of grievance associated with it. And one thing that you often hear is that they don't like to be on the losing side. I think there is some of that in that, right? I mean, they did not like to lose. It was a big shock. And I think, these are often people who win. Yeah. And they didn't like the people who they thought are very unintelligent. Remember that horrible phrase from a few years ago? Low information voters were the ones who had won the Brexit vote. I mean, it came as a huge shock for them. And I think their egos, and I really do think this, are still recovering from it.
Yeah.
And have never recovered.
And the always winning point is crucial, because it really didn't matter which party would get in, whether it's Labour or Tory, particularly in recent years, certainly pre-Brexit. What's the difference between New Labour and David Cameron? It's not a great chasm. They have similar views of the world, as we're discovering from all these podcasts that are coming out with supposedly people who claim to be political opposites, like Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, or Ed Balls and George Osborne, who actually agree on pretty much everything.
They're not really men of their time, because we do live in a time of genuine adversarialism and arguing and, trying to figure out where the society is moving. But they will always eschew that, because that's kind of seen as beneath them a little bit, sort of slugging it out, fighting it out, doing things on principle.
And finally, Tom, do you think, have we lost a little bit of the Brexit spirit, I guess? It feels certainly like perhaps one reason the Remainers, feel a bit more in charge is that the sort of Brexiteers have gone into hiding.
Yeah, I think there's always been a bit of an issue with, first of all, that the Remainers continued campaigning almost as soon as the vote was over, because they didn't accept the results. So they've kind of continued up that level of momentum. I think particularly the kind of political leaders, the prominent leaders of the Leave campaign, were quite complacent. They kind of thought that it would be either a land of milk and honey instantly, or that they really underestimated the scale of opposition that they would see, both from within the political class, from the civil service, as you alluded to in your introduction, all the way up until, of course, the European Union itself. The fight that they were picking with technocrats of all kinds of different colours was huge, and I think they weren't necessarily steeled for that particular fight. I think Leave voters in general, there's definitely a sense in which they've been demoralised, been browbeaten by a narrative. They've also been browbeaten by, as we've now come to realise, dodgy statistics about how supposedly terrible the impact of Brexit has been on the economy, and being told by everyone and their mother that this is their fault, and they're now having to taste the harsh medicine of their own particular decision. So I think that we've got a work cut out for us in order to kind of make clear that that is complete nonsense, and to dislodge that myth which has lodged itself very much in the public discussion. But at the same time, I really don't think that this idea that we're back to business as usual, we're back to Ed Balls and George Osborne, or various different iterations of those characters dancing gleefully together on the head of a pin. Those days have not returned. We're in a bit of a reprieve. We're in a moment in which the populist kind of forces have been beaten back to a certain degree. But the idea that ordinary people have decided that actually the Remainers were right to say they shouldn't have a role in politics. They were right to say that the status quo isn't good enough. That they were wrong to say that the status quo isn't good enough. That actually have decided that they were wrong, that the political class are a bunch of people who range from hapless to actually quite malevolent. This has not been a kind of case that they've just decided to give up. They've just been beaten back by the fact that there's been such a concerted effort to try and frustrate their vote and try to slowly reverse it, which is what we're kind of seeing now. So I think the complacency is now very much on the Remainer side. They think they've won. They think they've returned to kind of prominence, but I think they're going to get a shock as soon as a proper choice is presented to the electorate once again. But I think we are in for a bit more demoralisation yet, sadly.
Here at Spiked, we talk a lot about the dangers of big tech, and I'm sure you're well aware that companies like Facebook and Google pose a very serious threat to your privacy by putting all of your private information up for sale online. The good news is that there's a way for you to both reclaim your privacy and keep nosy big tech companies out of your data. And if you've been itching to do just that, I cannot recommend ExpressVPN enough. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why pay for a VPN at all when I can just use one for free? Well, the bottom line is that all VPNs cost you in some way. And while you might pay nothing up front, those free alternatives you might have seen are actually making money by selling your data to advertisers. With ExpressVPN, you just don't need to worry about that. ExpressVPN doesn't log your online activity. They've even developed a unique technology called Trusted Server that stops the VPN from tracking and storing your information. With ExpressVPN, you pay for what you get. And thanks to their new lightweight protocol, ExpressVPN offers faster speeds than ever before. There's no buffering, no pixelated videos. You really don't have to sacrifice your fast broadband speeds to protect your privacy. Also, please don't let my talk of servers and protocols put you off either. ExpressVPN requires no technical skills whatsoever. It is incredibly easy to use. All it takes is clicking one button to connect. If you think your mum, dad, grandma, or even your tech-illiterate grandson needs a safe way to stay online, then let them know that ExpressVPN is built for everyone. Why else would Mashable, The Verge, and plenty of other tech magazines rate ExpressVPN the best that you can get? So, to protect yourself with the VPN that I use and trust, you can use our link expressvpn.com/spiked today, and you can get an extra 3 months for free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/spiked. expressvpn.com/spiked. Visit expressvpn.com/spiked to learn more. So a new school term has recently begun, and Rishi Sunak's government has once again failed to produce guidance on how schools should deal with children who say they are transgender. A couple of months ago, the government had actually floated banning social transitioning, which is where a child or anyone else essentially declares themselves to be another gender and everyone goes along with it. The school agrees to change that pupil's name and they can wear the opposite uniform. Now the government says, or Rishi Sunak says, he's proceeding with just extreme caution. Candice, it feels like this is not good enough. I mean, this is a very serious issue that the government keeps wanting to punt into the long grass.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, schools genuinely need guidance on this. I mean, we can't just rely on judgment or common sense or, what your individual opinion is. It doesn't work that way anymore. So teachers do need to know, do I actually have to quit my job, or will I be forced, will I be compelled to use pronouns, for instance, that I don't want to use? I think that the essence of social transition is that it's social, it involves everybody. So we need to know what's going to happen. I mean, my position on it, I don't think will surprise anyone. I mean, I don't think it's a neutral act. I don't think it should be happening. I do recognize, however, that, in the interest of liberties, people should be able to pursue things that they genuinely want to pursue. But, parents and teachers need to know. And I feel like at the moment, because we're just before an election, they're avoiding controversy and they're sort of trying to pitch at the centre ground, this illusory centre ground that they think exists. And, this actually going to cause a lot of problem for parents who've been campaigning on this for so long and are so disappointed about it.
And I guess that's the point, is that there's so much going wrong in schools at the moment, Tom. What is happening without guidance is just crazy, with children being socially transitioned behind parents' backs, for instance.
And that was one of the things that sparked this. It wasn't the fact that people were concerned about where this might go. There were revelations, as you say, of young children being socially transitioned behind their parents' backs. You add to that the context of the fact that we have been seeing kind of PSHE lessons or things of that nature, or outside organisations invited into schools to talk about the gender issue, and therefore to essentially propagandise a particular view on the idea that we have this thing called a gender identity, kind of a bit like a soul, to push these ideas to children.
Yeah.
And then to have policies in place or informal practices in place, which is to allow that child to socially transition without necessarily even talking to the parents about it. This is really quite sinister stuff. This isn't hypothetical. This is something which has been very clear. You also pair that with the sex education fiasco, which has been going on. It's kind of around the same time, back in March, Rishi Sunak said, we're going to have this review into what's been going on in terms of sex education, because, again, there'd been these revelations about quite young children being shown materials which their parents were not allowed to look at, often on kind of trumped up intellectual property grounds, which no one really bought, around some quite adult stuff. We're talking about masturbation, we're talking about fisting, things of this nature. I feel gross to talk about in this podcast, but it's still the sort of thing where this is something that parents were naturally very concerned about. That review seems like it will never see the light of day. Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, has said that they will potentially talk about the recommendations or something, but not the kind of meat of the particular review that has taken place. So again, you have this irony, as Joanna Williams talked about on Spike this week in her column, of this issue of parents being really concerned about what is going on behind their backs in schools, this culture of secrecy which has crept in the name of inclusion, but still, I think, completely phony. And yet the response is more caginess from the government. And what I really don't understand about it, or I suppose I do understand about it, but I think it's shameful, is Sunak does kind of know better. I mean, he's refusing to pick a side more firmly, but I don't think he's a kind of natural wokester by any stretch of the imagination. I think I believe the people who say that he's quite naturally kind of a bit more socially conservative than your average Tory MP, shall we say. And I think, what is it that's stopping him from doing this? As Candice was saying, there's that kind of concern running up to an election, wanting to appeal to the kind of imagined median voter. The median voter is completely on board with taking this stuff on, so that doesn't really wash to me. You even think about the way in which, yes, you're going to upset Stonewall, but the Tory party upset Stonewall by breathing. There are never going to be won over to their particular kind of their perspective. Pink News are never going to write glowing op-eds about what the Tory party is doing in government in relation to this particular issue. And what I think it comes down to is the fact that his own party and his own cabinet and this has been true for a very long time, are as up to their eyeballs in this gender identity nonsense as any other party. They are the party that is responsible for bringing through potentially the changes to the Gender Recognition Act, which then got quashed. They are the party who have been pushing, from the backbenches as strongly for this ban on supposed trans conversion therapy, which would effectively negate any ability to talk to confused youngsters and try and suggest maybe another path is better. They have been, as we've seen with Gillian Keegan, who has said in an interview that she doesn't think 16 is too young to transition.
Yeah.
On the grounds that when she was 16, she had a job and she was paying tax. And as Joanna was saying, it's not like having a Saturday job. It's actually much more serious and potentially irreversible. So I think it's shameful, but he's effectively throwing vulnerable young children under the bus for the sake of party management.
Yeah.
And that's if that is all it comes down to, I think that is pretty striking.
And to add to that list, it was the Tories who brought in the kind of compulsory PSHE/sex education that has led to schools to seek out all this outside advice as well. So they're totally to blame for it, and they are not taking responsibility for cleaning it up.
They're completely confused. I mean, it's not something you would expect of a Conservative government, but I think it's just having quite a lax attitude to these things, not really managing properly. And I think the point that Tom made is such a good one. Why do people assume that the median voter is just wishy-washy, doesn't really have an opinion? Sometimes the mass view on something can be quite a strong opinion. I mean, it can be quite a definitive opinion. I mean, always trying to find the middle ground, that's not always possible and not desirable, actually.
And in cases like these, finding the middle ground, avoiding confrontation just leaves it open to the most extreme views, actually.
Yes, because they will assert themselves. They've got no problem doing it.
And Tom, do you think we can make any progress on this issue? Are they just not interested in...
It seems like it. I mean, I did wonder whether, because Rishi Sunak doesn't really have much to say for himself at the moment, all of his other pledges are kind of going awry. I mean, yes, people are primarily concerned about inflation and the questions of the border and so on. There are bigger fish to fry, but you did think, perhaps naively, that this would be such an easy, straightforward way to do something which the vast majority of people see as an important issue and see as the Tory party still just about as the one party slightly more likely to do something about it, but he still failed miserably. But I think it does come down to the fact that throughout all this gender critical battle, it has always been about people from outside the political class putting pressure on the political class to do something, whether it's the gender critical feminists, the kind of parents groups which are popping up to challenge some of these materials. That's always been the story, and I have a lot of faith in their ability to make a difference given how much change has happened in even the past couple of years, really.
And finally, let's talk about this incident in Peckham. A video has gone viral, essentially showing an Asian shopkeeper allegedly manhandling a black woman. And it's kind of been seized upon as a racist incident. So there have been protests outside the shop. Many of the sort of race equality charities have got involved. I mean, Tom, I know it's early days and it's probably a bit too early to say, we can't even say what happened really. But, what have you made of the reaction to it?
Yeah, well, it's difficult because on the one hand, there is this video which is naturally going to upset people. So you've got a shopkeeper, an Asian gentleman, manhandling, as you say, a woman who's about 30 years old. It seems like going on the reporting, this is somewhere between a bust up over a refund through to, as was alleged on the other side, a kind of case of shoplifting that she came in. She wanted a refund. She was denied it. She was alleged to then try to basically just take what she felt she was owed, and then he tries to stop her from leaving. At one point, is seen putting a hand around her throat, and then that's going to put anyone's nose out of joint. That's going to concern anyone. But at the same time, the question of what really went on here is never obvious from a bit of CCTV footage or from a bit of, camera phone footage.
Yeah.
Very quickly, a very crude and simplistic racial narrative was imposed upon this, which I think we should take very seriously and be very concerned about, which is to say that this was, as you say, instantly a racist incident without anyone stopping to wonder or check whether or not there's any evidence to suggest racial animus plays a role here, rather than someone overreacting or reacting poorly to a particular situation. It has also taken on a new grim dimension insofar as the racial dynamics have become quite pronounced. A lot of the protests talking about we don't do this to your women, why do you do it to our women? Signs left on the shutters of the shop, which hasn't been able to open for a number of days now, referring to them as parasitic merchants. Constant talk about you people, i.e. South Asians, effectively running these businesses in our community. You're starting to see this kind of really grim identity politics being imposed upon it. And also this being done quite explicitly by not just race equality charities, but also various groups which kind of range from wannabe black nationalists to sort of identitarian groups. I mean, Ngozi Fulani, if anyone remembers her from the Lady Hussey microaggressions scandal, was there addressing the crowd there. Forever Family, who people might remember from 2020, which is a slightly confusing group. No one really knows what it is actually that they do, but gentlemen who walk around in kind of stab vests, seemingly to kind of evoke a kind of black nationalist kind of paramilitary vibe, who again were out there making their presence felt. It's taken on a pretty grim kind of racial tone, and there has been this rush to judgment, which I think takes us into a territory that we really don't want to go into, something that happens in America, which essentially, based on the identity of the alleged perpetrator or the identity of the alleged victim, no one stops to work out what actually happened. They just impose this crude racial script on it and then let rip. And I think we're seeing that repeated here, and we really don't want to see that start to become a feature of life in diverse modern Britain, as it were.
Yeah, Candice, I wanted to ask you in particular about the sort of rush to judgment aspect. That has been quite worrying.
Yes, yeah. I mean, what Tom said, I mean, all of it, totally. That's the way I see it. So, you know, it's worrying because it's actually very dehumanizing. You know, instead of seeing just human beings, people who could just be making terrible decisions in the heat of the moment, clashing personalities, just things that are quite ordinary. We see people playing out grand narratives, grand racial narratives, grand political narratives. And there is something very particular to our social media age in which people do that. You know, obviously it's a big American phenomenon, as Tom said. I mean, you look at the woman, the city bike Karen, and there was, oh my gosh, I mean, there was so much discussion about whether she was in the wrong or whether she was in the right. And no one could accept, you know, maybe on both sides there was a bit of confusion, not understanding each other properly, a bit of bad temper.
This was a woman who got upset at someone taking a bike that she'd hired.
Yes. Yeah. And but the boys on the other side said, no, it was my bike and I was just recharging it. And, you know, we'll never know whether there was... One thing I objected to is people tried to make her either all good or all bad, or the boy is all good or all bad. There was just no room for just nuance. You know what? People sometimes have really bad disagreements with each other and do stupid things, and it's just as simple as that.
And Tom, in terms of the sort of the racial dynamic here, I mean, it's interesting. You've had some people come out and say, particularly on Twitter and on videos and things like that, saying that, you know, white supremacy is to blame, when really, you know, there's no white people involved as far as I can tell.
No, exactly. And I think it's a reminder that this identity politics, this victim politics, some of which is being pushed very explicitly by some of the campaigners in and around this case, but also it's just sort of in the air, it's in the water, isn't it, at the moment, is such a big problem if you want to live in a genuinely kind of diverse society, if you will. Because this isn't just about, by pushing a kind of politics of racial victimhood, by pushing a politics of racial division, by encouraging people to see every interaction, good, bad, and in between, as an expression of some sort of racial dynamic, unconscious biases, and so on. It's not just bad because it means white people occasionally have to feel uncomfortable, or they're going to be accused of racism here or there and boo-hoo about that. It's really going to become a big problem in terms of creating or exacerbating pre-existing frictions between ethnic minority groups themselves. This is one thing that often isn't really talked about in the question of race relations and anti-racism. But as Rakib Hassan, Spike Collins, has made this point in another outlet about how when ethnic minorities were in polls, there was a Hope Not Hate report a couple of years ago, a plurality of them will say, as in more say than not, that the tensions between ethnic minorities is more stark than it is between ethnic minorities and white people, for instance. And that's something which, again, if we continue to push this politics of victimhood, if we continue to push this idea that we all belong to these kinds of groups and that whenever some sort of incident happens, we have to rally back to our side, you're going to stoke up potentially ethnic conflict. I don't mean that in a violent sense necessarily, but certainly a lot of animosity, as we've seen on the streets of South London this week, which is not about which won't necessarily even involve white people. This isn't about tears for the white majority, and they're sorry a lot in this. This is about the fact that the more you kind of balkanize society, the more tension you store up. And I just think it's so clear we're starting to go down that road, very much influenced by America. And we need to stop, because it's something which, as soon as you adopt that lens of society, it's very difficult to kind of push it away and go back to kind of seeing yourselves as citizens again, if you see what I mean.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.